The sermon title tonight is A Daughter-in-Law Better Than 7 Sons. And we are looking at Ruth chapter 4, the entire chapter. In the last few weeks we have seen in the book of Ruth loyalty and provision illustrated. Tonight we will focus on how God providentially sets up events and accomplishes His purposes. And we're going to see tonight in this passage how these events accomplish what God has intended. So if you'll join with me, looking at the beginning of chapter 4 in the book of Ruth. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there. When the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along, Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here." And they did so. Then he said to the kinsman redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. We're going to pause here for a moment. If you recall, when the last time we had gathered and we're talking about this, Ruth had gone to Boaz on the threshing floor and told him that she wanted him to be a kinsman redeemer. And he said that he would be willing, but they had this other relative who is not really mentioned other than kind of as a generic reference as this person out there. He's not important to the story really, except that he is kind of an obstacle between Ruth and Boaz coming together. And so Boaz says, there is another who has the right before I do, or has the responsibility before I do. And so we're going to do this the right way. I will go and settle this matter. And so we see in the beginning of chapter 4, Boaz goes to his relative, waits for him at the city gate. And this is the part of town where business was conducted. And we might kind of think of it today kind of like the courthouse steps. In the ancient world, your cities would have walls around them and they would have gates. And that's where people would gather to conduct business. And so the elders of the city or the town would come together, and they would, if you were going to transact business, you would do it in front of all of these witnesses so that there was a remembrance of it, a record of it, so to speak. Today, we draw up contracts and have things notarized and all of that. But at this time, they met and they discussed things and they just had witnesses to transact business. And Boaz gets attention of him, gets some elders around, some of the important people in the town. He tells the situation to this relative of his. He describes it as an opportunity to acquire Elimelech's land. And then the relative says, I'll redeem it. And so understand though, Boaz has not given him the full picture yet. He said, Naomi has some land she wants to sell. In other words, she doesn't have a way to provide for herself, and she's going to need to sell this property. Now eventually you would have property that would be expected to return to the descendants, to return to the people who own it. But if Elimelech is dead and there are no heirs, then there's nowhere for that property to go. So this man says, well, I'll redeem it. He sees this as an opportunity then to put himself in a good situation. But Boaz hasn't told him the whole story, and apparently he is not completely aware of everything that's been going on. So let's continue on in verse 5, and let's see what is here. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, and from Ruth the Moabitess you acquire, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the kinsman redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself." And he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses. Then the elders and all those at the gate said, We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrath and be famous in Bethlehem, through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman. May your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar born Judah. Boaz did not disclose everything he knew at first, but he also let the man know at this point that Ruth would be there. He would have to deal with Ruth. He would have to, through Ruth, raise up an heir for Elimelech. So what we see here is if this relative redeemed the land, he understood that Naomi was Elimelech's wife, his widow. And he knew that Naomi was probably beyond childbearing years. So if he got this land and had to care for Naomi, well, he would have to add another mouth to his family. He would have to have another mouth to feed. He would have an elderly woman to care for, a widow who is beyond childbearing age. And that's not necessarily so bad. He's thinking he could afford to have another mouth to feed. But once he finds out, oh no, Ruth also comes with this deal. And she's young enough that she may have children, and it would be his responsibility to make sure she had children so that there would be a son born who could then inherit the land. Now that changes the situation. Now he would be responsible for 2 women and children until a male child is born. So understand this, if he brought in Naomi to his home, well, he's just got another person to deal with, but he gets this land. He gets Elimelech's land. If he brings Naomi and Ruth into his home, now he's got to have children with Ruth until she has a male child. That first male child is going to be not considered his son, though it would be his son, but it would be considered for inheritance purposes the son of Elimelech. Well, what if you had 2 daughters first? Well, those are daughters, and daughters are not as valuable as sons in the ancient world. So that would be more children that you would have to feed. And once you have that son, now you have to raise up that son, and then he takes over and gets that inheritance. And he's your son, and he kind of counts as your son, but he really counts as your son, as the son of your dead relative. And he would have Naomi as his grandmother and Ruth as his mother. And so that puts a lot more strain on this guy's situation. So one old woman he seemed ready to care for, especially since she came with land, but add Ruth and children, and he's not willing to take that risk. Notice how he says that it would endanger his own estate. He's not willing to take that risk, so he revokes his right to redeem that land, to buy it from Naomi. And then we see Boaz formalizing the plan at the gate with the elders of the city present. He says, okay, he's not going to do it. Everybody's witnesses. He's revoked his right. I'm going to buy this land, and I'm going to take Naomi, and then I'm going to take Ruth also into my family and to raise up a child for our dead relative. And then the crowd affirms that. The elders affirm what's going on, and they offer some blessings there. Let's continue with verse 13, and we'll close out the chapter. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram. Ram the father of Amminadab. Amminadab the father of Nahshon. Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon the father of Boaz. Boaz the father of Obed. Obed the father of Jesse. And Jesse the father of David. We see here, as we can come to the end of the book of Ruth, that Boaz and Ruth are married and they have a child. And notice that the women say, who has the child? Who has a son? In verse 16, Naomi has a son. And it's actually, of course, Ruth's child, but it counts as one who will inherit the land of Elimelech. And I said from the very beginning that this book is about God's faithfulness to Elimelech and to Naomi. And so here in the latter part of chapter 4, we see that Elimelech, who had died, whose sons had died, now has a male heir. And the women say that Naomi has a son. God has orchestrated events and provided an heir for Elimelech. Now Obed, the heir, would inherit Elimelech's land. And notice he also may have had an inheritance from Boaz, because he is considered, for legal purposes, an heir of Elimelech. He's considered his heir, but he is still Boaz's son. And we know Boaz seems to be a very well-off man, so he may also get an inheritance from his actual father, along with his other father's children. But that's going to depend on a number of things. In any case, Boaz would raise him like a son, but realizing that this son was an heir to Elimelech. And notice that Ruth is praised as better than 7 sons. Now we need to really see that that is a huge compliment. Okay? Women were not valued the same way that men were. Female children were not valued the way that male children were. One, they couldn't inherit land. They were not allowed to have an inheritance like this. 2, the men were the ones who provided. They were the ones who worked land. And a woman would work the household, which was a job, and there was work to do. There was plenty of work. But the men's job was to go out and work the fields and hunt and do those kinds of things to provide for the family. And so sons are seen as important because they provide and they take care of their elderly parents in ways that daughters did not. And to say that Ruth is better than 7 sons is a tremendous compliment, because remember, Ruth is not even an Israelite. She's not even a Hebrew person, is she? She's a Moabite woman. She's not one of the chosen people. She just married in. And they are saying how important she is to Naomi, how much of a compliment this is. And I think we also need to realize that Boaz, he already would have had a family. So he would have now had to take in another wife. So that's certainly not the kind of thing that we do today. I believe one wife is more than enough. I really am not looking to have any other wives. But at this time, men would sometimes have multiple wives. And in cases like this, it was a responsibility to take in your dead relative's wife, not for your benefit necessarily, but for their benefit. So it was a responsibility to do, and Boaz does that. So as we look at what is going on in the text and what has transpired through the book of Ruth, there's several things that we want to look at. And the big idea with Ruth is, I think, that God's plans are beyond our own plans. Naomi never would have thought that at any point in this story, and even in the pre-story of what her life was like before the story started, when she was getting married to Elimelech, probably she never thought, we'll end up moving out of the country and he'll die and my sons will die, but then I'll have a foreign woman, daughter-in-law, who will have a child and who will end up being an heir. That wouldn't have been a plan she would have even considered, right? That's nothing like we would have ever thought that would happen. We would have thought, well, I'll get married, we'll have kids, and they'll have kids, and we'll have a big family. But that's not the way it turned out. And we know that Naomi was bitter about this, right? When she came back to Bethlehem, she's bitter. She said God has made her bitter. But God's plans are beyond our own plans. Now, I want you to think with me for a minute. So you're going to have to kind of do a little thought experiment with me for a minute and see if you can follow my line of thought here. Why was there a famine in Bethlehem at the beginning of the book of Ruth? Think about that. We're told that it happened. Why? And really, there are many reasons. And if you think about it for a minute or two, you may come up with some answers. We may come up with some ideas. Well, that's how you got Elimelech to move his family. That's how they got in touch with Ruth and all of that kind of stuff. But before we go through some of those, think about this answer. There was a famine in Bethlehem in the book of Ruth so that we would be here in church this evening. That famine took place in part so that we would be here tonight. God has put in place the history of the world, at least some little part, so that we would be here tonight. Because if you look, who is in the family tree of our Savior, Jesus Christ? Ruth, Boaz, and technically through Elimelech, because Obed counts as an heir for Elimelech. When you go to the end and we see that this child is in the family tree of David, and Jesus is a descendant of David, then we see that if it wasn't for the famine in Bethlehem, then we wouldn't have David, and if we didn't have David, we wouldn't have Jesus. Pretty amazing, isn't it? God worked a famine in the book of Ruth that eventually led to Jesus, and Jesus is the only reason why we ought to be here. So it's pretty amazing that God had us in mind even back in the famine in Bethlehem that's recorded in the book of Ruth. Now we're going to kind of look through some of these steps because I do think it is important for us to look at just the chain of events that we see just in the book of Ruth. So let's look at these chain of events that lead eventually to Jesus, and because of Jesus, ultimately to us. So God orchestrated events to provide the lineage of David, eventually Jesus. The famine in Bethlehem is the first one that we see in the book of Ruth. And then we see the death of Elimelech very early on. So there had to be a famine, and then Elimelech had to die. The marriage of Moabite women. When Elimelech's sons got married, they had to get married in order so that Ruth would be a daughter-in-law to Naomi. Because as a daughter-in-law to Naomi, she came back with her. So they had to marry Moabite women. And the death of Elimelech's sons. Wow, in the first 4 things we're seeing people had to die so that this could happen. I'm sure that we wouldn't volunteer for those positions, right? We wouldn't want to volunteer, God, you're going to do something that means that I have to die. Like Elimelech died, or like Mahlon and Chilion died. We wouldn't say that, well, I want to get in line, put me down for that spot. But that's what had to happen. Not only the famine in Bethlehem that caused them to move, but then the end of the famine. It had to end because they had to come back. And not only did the famine have to end, but Ruth had to be fairly stubborn. Because Naomi told her to go back to her family, and what did she say? I'm going to go with you. She had to kind of be a little obstinate to her mother-in-law. I'm going to go with you. You're not getting rid of me. And if Ruth had said, okay, well, I'll go back to my family, then we don't have David. So Ruth had to be a little stubborn. Look also, the program of gleaning the fields to care for the vulnerable. Why did Ruth meet Boaz? Because she went to glean his fields. Why did she go to glean his fields? Because the law said you have to not harvest the corners of your fields, and you had these restrictions to provide for those who were vulnerable. God had to set up, even earlier in the Old Testament, these laws about how you glean your field so that Ruth would find Boaz's field and glean in his field so that Ruth would meet Boaz. Are you seeing how big God's comprehension is so far? All of that so we could be here tonight, so that Jesus could be born, so that David could be born. So the program of gleaning the fields to care for the vulnerable had to be in place. And then Ruth's path to Boaz's field. Remember, we talked about the fact that there were a lot of fields. She ended up in Boaz's field. We said that, well, that wasn't by chance, although the Bible just says, oh, and it just so happened that she ended up in Boaz's field. But we realized that God had that in plan, and He had to do whatever it took to get her to go to Boaz's field. And then Boaz had to notice Ruth. He had to be paying attention. He had to see her, and he had to hear about her, because he had heard about her and her character, that she was taking care of her mother-in-law. Not only that, Boaz had to be in a situation of being able to provide for Ruth and Naomi. Remember, we said Boaz is probably fairly wealthy. Well, if Boaz had been barely getting by, he may not have been able to be generous to Ruth and Naomi. And then maybe they wouldn't have considered him as a kinsman redeemer and wouldn't have asked him to do that. So Boaz needed to be able to provide that, to be generous. Boaz's character, to care for his kinsmen, is another thing. What if Boaz had been a scoundrel? If Boaz didn't say, you know what, we need to care for our relatives' widows. We need to do that. If Boaz had bad character, then he wouldn't have been kind to them. Boaz's consideration of Ruth's situation and his protection for her. Remember, he had heard about her and he saw that she was an honest worker. She was working hard, and he provided food for her. He had her dine with him, eat with him. He said, you can drink out of these water jars. Don't go to anybody else's field. Stay here. I've told my people not to hurt you. You can go with my girls and pick up the gleanings. If Boaz didn't do that, then Ruth may not have gone back to his field. But he told her to stay there. And he said he would protect her while she was gleaning. What about Naomi's care to get Ruth a husband? Naomi had to have that idea, right? She had to get over her bitterness. She got bitter, but she had to get over that to decide to get a husband, want a husband for Ruth. What about Ruth's devotion and care for Naomi? Not only is Ruth willing to find a husband, but no, she asks for that husband to be a kinsman redeemer to raise up an heir for Elimelech, knowing that that will mean Naomi will be cared for as well. And then the whole practice of levirate marriage to provide an heir. And I don't think we've talked about this too much, but the idea of marrying your dead brother's wife to provide an heir is known as levirate marriage. And that's a concept that we see that there are prescriptions about in the Old Testament, and there are rules for that, things that you're supposed to do. And we see that that practice was there, instituted by God to help keep people with their land, so that land would remain in the hands of the families to which it was given. So that whole practice of levirate marriage was in place so that Ruth would then tell Boaz that she wanted him to be a kinsman redeemer. And then Ruth's willingness to submit her will for the family. Ruth could have chased after younger men. She could have gone for men just to be her husband, but she cared for Naomi and wanted that family to continue. Ruth also had to be bold enough to approach Boaz. If she was really timid, if she was really kind of scared, maybe she wouldn't have gone up and said to him, I want you to be a kinsman redeemer, but she did. And then Boaz's willingness to go above and beyond for family. And if this sounds repetitive, it is repetitive of the whole things we've talked about through the book of Ruth. Boaz had to be willing to do that for his family, to provide. Boaz's determination to follow custom and allow the closer family member the option to redeem Elimelech's land. If he had just said, I'm doing that, then who knows what kind of scandals that might have caused. Someone may have said, well, he should have offered it to so-and-so because then he could have done that. And why did Boaz take that privilege and get that land? He shouldn't have done that. But we see that Boaz followed the right procedures and went to the council, to the elders at the gate, if you will. And the situation of the closer family member who was unable to make the kind of commitment. Now, this is really interesting too, church, because listen to me. Boaz was in a position, he had to be wealthy enough to take in Ruth and Naomi and to raise children for them. And this other family member had to be not wealthy enough to do it. Do we get that? Because if he had had enough money, if he had had more money, maybe he said, okay, I'll do it. But that's not how God had it planned out. So Boaz had to have wealth, and this other person who was willing to do it, if it didn't jeopardize his family, also had to have not enough money to be able to be comfortable doing that. This is going to have some implications as we go along. I'm just trying to draw this out to our attention here. And the willingness of the closer family member to pass his right to Boaz. He had to be at least willing enough to say, I can't do this. Why don't you do it? And then Boaz actually marrying Ruth, and then Ruth giving birth to Obed, and then Obed having a family and having a child called Jesse, and then Jesse having a child, David. And then we could go on and on and on and on from there until we arrive at Eastside Baptist Church tonight. On, what is this, August 16th tonight. All of those things had to happen in order for us to be here tonight. Of course, we know David is an important figure in Jewish and Christian history, and each of these events had to be put in place in order for David to be born. And David was necessary because Jesus is a descendant of David. And can you imagine how many things had to happen in just the right way for Boaz and Ruth to have a child? We can stretch this back and say, what had to happen so that Boaz would be born? What had to happen so that Ruth would be born? Or Naomi? Or Elimelech? And we could just go back and back further. You see, when the Bible tells us that God's ways are higher than our ways, and we start to try to trace out the events, just a few of these events, that all had to go into place just the right way in order for things to happen the way they did, what can you say other than wow? See, we've traced just a few events from this book, and we've got a whole list of events here. But the world is much more complicated, and there were many, many, many more events. What an awesome God who is able to put these things together and orchestrate them in such a way that we could be here tonight, to sing His praises and to worship Him. Because of God's plans, we can be confident that God is doing what is necessary for His ultimate plan, which is ultimately good. Because of God's plans, we can know that even if our situation looks bad, God may use it for good. Because of God's plans, we can trust that what He has called us to do will not be futile, even if we don't see the good that comes from it. And I want you to think here of Elimelech and his sons. Elimelech and his sons are vitally important for us to get to David. And for David, obviously we have to have David to get to Jesus. But like I said, which one of us would have signed up for that position? My purpose is to get married, move, and die. Or to move with my family, get married to foreign women, and die. God's purposes, however, see all that and work through all of that. And because of God's plans, we can follow Him wherever He leads. We can trust Him like a child trusts his or her parents. And you know, kids are not always 100% trusting. When they're younger, they are. As they get a little older, Mariah's in the back even shaking her head now. So my kids don't always trust me, especially when I have a plan that they don't know about. And I tell them we need to do something, or this is what's going on, and they sometimes are questioning me. As they get older, their questions they get a little more fearful. Oh, Daddy, you're going to move us up to Lake City? We're going to move from New Smyrna? Well, we like being down in New Smyrna. Why are we going to do that? Or we're going to go look at another house or whatever it is we're doing. And they don't always trust in just a kind of a very childlike way as they grow older. But ultimately, we may have a plan that they don't know about, and God has a plan. And we don't see all the pieces. But what we can see and what we can know is that He is trustworthy and He is good. And we don't have to know all the pieces, do we? We don't have to know all the pieces to know that God ultimately is going to work things away in a way that He accomplishes His will. And if we just look at all of the pieces that had to go into this 4-chapter book of Ruth and what they eventually led to, it's pretty amazing. And you know what? A God that can do all of that can be trusted with our problems too. He can be trusted with Eastside's problems. You realize that, church? We can trust God with our problems because He's able to work it all together, even if we don't see it, even if we don't understand it. And those answers to those problems, those ways God work it out, may not always turn out the way that we think it should. Just like Elimelech and his sons probably wished they got a chance to go back to Bethlehem, right? But God's plans are always what is ultimately the best. So tonight I just want to challenge us to follow God and to trust Jesus and to trust Him with our life even, because He's trustworthy and He's good. And we see, as we've seen through this tonight, He can put the pieces in place and accomplish His will even in the most unlikely of situations. Let us pray. Father, we thank You for this privilege we've had tonight. We thank You for the opportunity to share our concerns. We thank You for Ruth and the story of Elimelech and Boaz and Naomi, and we thank You for Your faithfulness in providing an heir for Elimelech, and which ultimately led to the ancestry of David and Jesus, and which led to us being here tonight. Thank You so much for loving us. Thank You for providing Jesus for us. Help us to live in a way that we trust You. Father, we ask all of these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen.